Good evening and welcome to the fifth in our series Embers and Sparks. My name is Eric Walker and it's my pleasure to be with the Orkney International Science Festival team again and hosting this pre-festival session. I'm joined by our guest speaker today, Andrew Painting. Andrew is a lifelong naturalist. He studied English literature at King's College London and environmental anthropology at Aberdeen. He's been working on landscape scale habitat restoration at Mar Lodge since 2016 and is most at home studying birds and plants somewhere up a hill. Tonight, Andrew will talk to us about regeneration of the Mar estate with its Caledonian pinewoods, subarctic mountains, bogs, moorland, burns and lochs. He challenges us with the statement, if we help nature to heal, it will give back tenfold in limiting and even reversing the impacts of climate change. Could this be a voice of hope within the often doom-laden environs of climate change? I'd like to ask our audience to play an active part tonight and ask you to please enter your comments and questions in YouTube's live chat, and I'll present them to Andrew after he's completed his talk. Andrew, welcome here tonight. I'm very much looking forward to your talk and the discussion that follows. Andrew, over to you.
Thanks very much, Eric. The pleasure to be here. I hope everyone can see the screen. Yes, thanks very much for having me along. I'm Andrew. There's a few little bits about social media stuff there. And as Eric says, I'll be talking about ecological restoration on a landscape scale, particularly in a Scottish context. I like to start with this slide of this rather beautiful golden eagle for the only reason that it's an absolutely beautiful creature. And it's the sort of species that can really give us hope for the future. Next slide, please. So my book is called Regeneration, the Rescue of a Wild Land. We hummed and hawed about the subtitle for a very long time and quite what to call it. Questions about what is wild land, what is wildlife, and what is our relationship with wilderness are very complicated and very interested. I won't dwell on them too much in this talk, but I certainly go into it a fair bit in the book. How we come to perceive certain things as wild and what values and what judgments we hold about creatures which we define as wild. Regeneration it's really a book of stories of other people's work, to be honest. I'm in a very privileged position where at Mar Lodge Estate I get to work with dozens and perhaps even hundreds of real experts in their field, people quietly working to make the world a better place. Of course, it's not all been good news. A lot of this work is very difficult. So there are stories of political difficulties and ecological difficulties. Climate change is a very big character in this book. Its spectre looms over all of the work we do. But these are really stories of resilience, reconnection, and regeneration. It's also important to say that the work we do here is interesting, and I would like to think very, very positive, but it's not perfect by any means. Of course, that's what makes it so interesting to work here. I work for the National Trust of Scotland. The National Trust of Scotland has owned Mar Lodge Estate since 1995, but this book was really written in a personal capacity. I should say that now. Next slide, please. So before we really jump into it, I think it's just worth asking ourselves, what is it we see when we look at a landscape? This isn't Mar Lodge. This is just down the road from us, a few miles away. It's, for many reasons, a very interesting place. I'll show this slide a bit later in the presentation as well. But for now, I think it's just worth trying to understand what these pictures evoke in us when we look at them. How do they make us feel? And what sort of judgments do we place on this sort of landscape? Next slide, please. So this is our land. This is Glenderry, the Glen of the Woodland Grove in the Gaelic. So what are we up to? So we're the largest national nature reserve in Scotland. We've 30,000 hectares of Caledonian pinewoods, moors, high montane corries, subarctic plateau. And the really exciting thing about the stuff we do is that we are managed for the benefit of the people of Scotland. The whole point of our work is that the National Trust for Scotland is a charity, but it holds the land in trust for the benefit of the nation, which I find a very exciting thing to think about when I get up in the morning and go to work. Next slide, please. We're a very cold place. We're a very high place. We're not a massively busy place, although that does seem to be changing after COVID. We're quite a biodiverse place. We've got 30% of Britain's red listed bird species breeding on the estate, 5% of Scotland's remaining Caledonian pinewood, 13% of Scotland's biodiversity action plan species, and well over 5,000 species on the books. So there's a lot of stuff here. So when the National Trust of Scotland took the place on it, it wasn't a complete blank canvas, as you'd say. Next slide, please. So we basically have three thrusts of our work at Mar Lodge: environmental conservation, public access, so whoever wants to come here is more than welcome to come and do whatever they want. And we're also a Highland sporting estate. So this is one of the things that makes Mar Lodge a bit different to some of the other, if we're going to call it that, rewilding estates you might see about. This is due to the sort of finances of when the estate went into National Trust of Scotland hands back in 1995. The National Trust of Scotland was really the front for a whole group of disparate organisations who came together to try and protect this land for the benefit of everyone. So one of those stakeholders was a Highland sporting interest. So we've committed to continuing Highland sport on the estate in a manner which is in harmony with environmental conservation and public access. So this is a really interesting thing about Mar Lodge, which makes it quite relevant for the rest of Scotland when we think about landscapes and landscape scale environmental change, because we're really trying to bring together people and cultures that are sometimes perceived to be clashing, and that's had its own challenges, but also it's a very interesting space in which to work, and one which I actually think can be very, very fruitful. Are we rewilding? I'd say we're really an attempt to reconcile disparate strands of the estate's nature, culture, and social history into one cohesive, nature-oriented whole. So we certainly use elements of rewilding practice to inform our landscape scale environmental restoration, but I wouldn't say we're a rewilding estate. We're an estate which uses rewilding to fulfill our charitable objectives. And actually, it's also worth saying that our management approach was really codified before the term rewilding got the sort of social cultural traction that it has done. I've started it's not a good joke, but I've started vaguely joking that we were pre-wilding because the project started before the term was popularized. We're also very lucky in that we're working to a 200-year vision. So where we want to be in 200 years' time is a place which connects habitats, wildlife, and people, past, present, and future, integrating conservation learning, recreation, field sports, and culture in one vast and diverse landscape at the heart of the Cairngorms National Park. We also want to be largely natural processes led, which of course brings us back to the concept of rewilding. This tree, by the way, is a particularly beautiful one. It's found right in the heart of the forest here. We think it's the second biggest pine in Scotland. We're not sure, but it's beginning to be on its way out, unfortunately. So it's maybe only got another 50 or 60 years left in it. But it's a really beautiful tree, and one I try and visit as much as possible when I'm out and about on the estate. Next slide, please. So I had to rummage through my my pictures on old computers and things for some pictures of Orkney, because it's been maybe 13 or 14 years since I've been there. So we are the farthest place inland from Scotland, inland in Scotland. So we're about as far from the sea as you can get. We don't have many low-level lochs, and we have a much more continental climate than Orkney. We're colder and drier. We have a higher tree line. We don't have much by way of good soil. We have very little in by land. But there are some similarities between Marlodge and Orkney. We share a lot of habitats, particularly the moorland and bog habitats. And we also share a lot of species with Orkney. So we're sort of sitting on a spectrum, I'd say, with what you're with what you have up in Orkney. Next slide, please. And you can kind of see that here. So this is one of our blanket bogs, full of cotton grass and looking quite nice. And if you sort of squint, you might think you're on Hoy, perhaps, in this picture. We're not just woodlands here, although a lot of our work is sort of focused around the woodlands, and we'll come back to why that was and why that is the case. So when people think of Marlodge, they often think of the high mountains and the Caledonian pinewoods, but there are also extensive areas of moorland, including something like 5,000 or 6,000 hectares of blanket bog. Next slide. Here is the Cairngorm Plateau. This is Benaverd from Benvein. And I think this picture nicely shows the sort of flatness on the top of the plateau. This is one of the things that makes this area very important in a national sense. We do have part of the highest area of very high ground in Scotland, and it's these big long plateaus which really set it apart from places like Ben Nevis, which have much smaller plateau areas. It's an absolutely vast area of ground above sort of 900 meters altitude, and that brings with it its own special species. Things like ptarmigan and dotterel, but also the rare plant species, weird rushes and things. Next slide. Here is the Caledonian pinewood. Again, this is in Glenderry, and as you can see here, it's nicely regenerating. We have about 1,000 hectares of Caledonian pinewood, but as we'll see, that's increasing. Next slide, please. And it's not just pines. We also have areas of birchwood. This is downy birchwood pine, a really important plant species. And when we think of the Caledonian pinewood, we need to remember that it's not just pines, or it shouldn't just be pines across most of its range. What we're really after and what we're looking after here is a biodiverse mix of species within a very complicated woodland habitat. Downy birch plays a big part of this, but there's also species like alder, juniper, rowan, and about 10 different types of willow, something like that. Next slide, please. So if you compare those pictures with this picture, and you can sort of pick out a few differences. Some of you might know, particularly if you're botanists, this is Cairngorms. This is off the back of Clashmouth, which is one of the best places in the country for Arctic alpine plants, or at least it was until fairly recently. Cairngorms Glen is notorious for being one of the few sites delisted from having its environmental designations, because over the years and within the span of a single human lifetime, the botanical interest in this glen has been very heavily damaged. And it's been damaged by big herds of deer. There's no two ways about that. If you look in the foreground, you can see sort of tracks of deer over the sort of boggier sections. About once a year, I go down into this glen and have a little bit of a rummage around for interesting plants. And you tend to these days have to take your life in your hands to sort of get on in this place. You need to be climbing up into the slopes and the scrabbling around in the screes and scrambling up cliff edges to really find the interesting plants. They are still there, just about clinging on. But I mean, the writer Aldo Leopold was talking about places in the US in the 1940s when he wrote about these landscapes being such a mountain, looking as if someone had given God a new pruning shears and forbidden him all other exercise. But this is also the way, for better or worse, that a lot of Scotland's high mountains do look. And we need to think about that and why that might be when we're walking in the hills. Next slide, please. So when the Trust took Mar Lodge on in 1995, the first problem, or the biggest problem that the Trust faced, was restoring the remnant Caledonian pinewoods on the estate. So Mar Lodge it's about 5% of the UK, of Scotland's Caledonian pinewoods. It's a big chunk. It's actually about 1,000 hectares, somewhere between 800 and 1,000 hectares, depending on how you count. It's a priority European habitat. The Trust had a legal obligation to bring it into favourable condition. But we need to think about scale as well. So 1,000 hectares might sound like a lot. And there's about 18,000 hectares of Caledonian woodland left in Scotland. There's actually over 18,000 hectares of heather moorland left on Mar Lodge estate alone. So when we're thinking about rarity and abundance, is really important to stress quite how rare big stands of Caledonian pinewood have become. Because of that, they have they have a very high importance for our overall biodiversity in Scotland, which far exceeds the amount of land that they currently cover. So at Mar Lodge in 1995, the Scots pines were generally over 200 years old. Scots pine tend not to live much longer than that. Certainly 300 would be pushing it for them. And Mar Lodge has a long, let's say, interesting social and cultural history. There have been people here since the Ice Age, and those people were living alongside the Caledonian pinewoods fairly well for most of that time. The wheels started coming off in sort of the turn of the 17th century, when forestry started becoming more of an industry. And then by the turn of the 19th century, we were really into a series of clearances, first for forestry, and then to make way for red deer to hunt. So Mar Lodge Estate was one of the original deer forests. It was one of the original places set aside for red deer to hunt on the open hill, in what we would now think of as the Highland sporting tradition. People have been writing about the decline of the Caledonian pinewoods at Mar Lodge for at least 100 years. Seaton Gordon mentions it, so does Adam Watson, and quite a few other people in between. Certainly, we can say there was no woodland regeneration here in any real way over the last 200 years. And due to historical records and all the rest of it, we can very firmly attribute that to high levels of red deer on the estate, which were managed principally for Highland sport. Next slide, please. So we know what the problem was, and we know what was causing the decline of the Caledonian pinewoods at Mar Lodge. You think there would be a fairly simple solution. If you reduce the deer numbers, then hopefully the number of the regenerating woodlands would sort of look after themselves. So that's what the Trust intended to do. We started with an adaptive management strategy. We thought we'd reduce the deer herd from, well, 3,000-ish in 1995. It was actually up at 5,500 on the estate in 92 and 3. We decided to reduce that to try and get it to around 5 per square kilometre. We thought that would be enough to get the trees away. We didn't particularly want to revert to using fencing, partly because this treats the symptoms, not the cause. It also means that woodland restoration will only ever happen in the areas which are fenced. And there are also knock-on effects for species like black grouse, capercaillie, and also landscape issues as well. You know, we want people to come here and enjoy their walks, and fencing will, to a certain extent, have an impact on the visual side of the landscape. It's hard to stress how against the grain, particularly in Upper Deeside, this was when the Trust started. Balmoral's just 10 or 12 miles down the road. This really was going against the grain at the time. Next slide, please. So you'd think it would be easy, and you'd think it might be a simple enough thing to do, but when we think about environmental issues and when we think about ecology, we need to have two heads on. We need to think first of all about what the ground can hold and what we can do. But if I was to put my anthropologist hat on or my social science hat on, it's equally important to think about culture, what people hold dear, and again, how people think about the ground and how people feel when they look at specific landscapes. This is the Stag Ballroom. It's quite a remarkable building. It's just a few hundred meters from where I'm sitting here at my lodge. There are something like 2,500 stag antlers, stag heads in the room, all shot in the late 19th century. If ever there was a way of showing people the importance of the red deer to Highland sporting culture and to Upper Deeside from the 19th century onwards, then it's this building. It's probably I've gotten a bit used to this building now. I don't really bat an eyelid when I go in, but every now and then I remember that it's perhaps a slightly unusual building. Next slide, please. But it's a very good illustration of why, when we're thinking about addressing big issues which on the face of it seem ecological or scientific, things like climate change, we're not just addressing climate change, we're addressing people's lives. If you're a deer stalker and you lived up here and your father was a deer stalker and his father was a deer stalker, you might feel a bit strongly that someone is coming along and telling you that what you're doing is wrong. So the Trust, we have a commitment to continue field sports on the estate, and I feel quite strongly that this is generally quite a good thing for us to continue doing as part of the wider ecosystem, as it were, of landscape scale restoration projects. On the flip side of that, we also had a legal obligation to bring the woodlands back into favourable condition, as well as, of course, as an ethical and moral obligation to do just that. We needed to think about cultural, social, and economic impacts of interventions. Stalking deer is expensive, and the work would take a long time. We also have to think about the ethical and moral considerations of killing native species. If we're reducing deer densities, the only way to do that is to send them off to the butchers, and we need to think about that quite closely when we're working out conservation interventions. You know, when is it okay to kill one species so that other species might do well? it's a question with no easy ethical answers, and it's one that, whether you're thinking about killing non-native grey squirrels to protect red squirrels, or deer to protect trees, or foxes to protect lapwing, is one we need to consider very, very closely, I would say. Next slide. So did it work? I'll just ask you to go through these quite quickly, the next sort of 4 or 5. It was certainly quite difficult for us. The trust got a lot of kickback. It took a long time for us to work out how to reduce deer density successfully, but also that caused a lot of concern within the Highland sporting community. People were worried about their jobs, their livelihoods, and their way of life at the end of the day. And for a long time, we simply weren't getting the results that we wanted. As it turned out, that was simply because there were too many deer still. So we've worked out a balancing act. So I would like to stress at this point that we do still have red deer at Mar Lodge. We still have a fairly big herd of about 1,700 red deer. These mostly live in the south and west of the estate, and they're a really important part, as I've said, of local culture. But also, we're the UK's largest national nature reserve. I mean, we want to have the UK's largest land mammal on the estate. So I think we're beginning to get into a position now where we're seeing really good benefits of our work. So next slide, please. So this is an area of Caledonian pinewood which was felled in the Second World War. You can see the stumps, and you can see that since the Second World War, nothing has grown back, and that's entirely due to high numbers of deer in this area since then. But if we go to the next slide, you'll see that that's no longer the case. These pictures were taken 10 years apart. The first one was taken in 2011, right during the sort of really difficult political period for the estate. This picture was taken by myself just last year. And we're beginning to get to the point now where it's getting quite hard to take these fixed point photos because there's too many trees in the way of a lot of them. If we go to the next slide. This is another one from 2011. We actually took about, well, I say we, the team here took about 1,000 photos back in 2011, and we've been repeating them every 5 years. It's not just pines that are getting away, and this is really exciting for us. So next slide. This was last year, and you can see that birch and rowan are really coming away in big numbers now. So we really are seeing the return of the Caledonian pinewood to this area at a landscape scale, which is a really important thing. I mean, ecology tends to work best at a landscape scale, and we are beginning to see that here now. Next slide. It's not just trees that we're interested in. We're also interested in the way watercourses change. If we think about rewilding, if we're going to use that term, it's not just about allowing the natural processes of say, woodland creation to get away. We also need to think about hydrological processes and what benefits we can have looking forward to addressing problems like climate change with increased storm frequencies and that sort of thing. So if we see this picture in 21, next slide. You can see there's been quite a lot of erosion on the cliff edges where the trees aren't, but trees are very good at stabilizing riverbanks, stopping carbon-rich soils escaping into the waters, that sort of thing. Next slide. And again, we'll see a similar thing here. You can see erosion tracks on the back of the face at the top of the photo there. But if we go to the next slide, we'll see that's no longer the case. And trees are stabilizing this slope and sequestering carbon and all the rest of it. Next slide. We've also taken down internal fences. Again, keep an eye here on the way the river's changed. So next slide. Things have we had 2 big storm events, and these have really re-wiggled the rivers for us. It's creating gravelly areas for trout and salmon, and it's also created great habitat for the shingle specialist species. There's all sorts of weird insects and plants that love it on those shingle areas, and we're seeing them come back in very big numbers now as well. But you can also see in between these pictures the things that don't change. You might have noticed that there's a log in the foreground in this picture that hasn't moved in the last 10 years. That log will probably be there for another few decades yet. When we think about alive forests, we need to think not just beyond the trees which are alive, but also the deadwood, which is a hugely important part of any sort of woodland ecosystem and is its own sort of sequestering place for carbon. Next slide. I think this is the last one of these. So we're working to a landscape scale, and in conjunction with taking these photographs, we did also map the total area of regenerating woodland on the estate, and we found we have about 2,000 hectares of it now, below 600 meters altitude, with more coming above that, so this high montane woodland. So there's a lot to think about, and there's a lot of change, and this is almost entirely down to simply reducing deer densities on the estate. So next slide. In suitable areas, it really can get away in a big way. And the next slide, please. Again, this one shows what's happening at a landscape scale, and again, watch the river on this one. Next slide. Much wider and loopier than it used to be, and you can also see birch getting away in this one as well, which is very exciting for us. Next slide. So when we think about fighting climate change and fighting the environmental emergency, we need to think beyond just growing trees. We need to think about the right tree in the right place. And there are plenty of places across Scotland where actually we might not want any trees at all. But when we work using natural processes, you can see what happens is the trees grow where they want to rather than where we think they want to. So we get areas of very dense pinewood regeneration along the riverbanks, close to seed sources. Away from seed sources, we'll see much less regeneration getting away, certainly in the short term. And then we see the birches growing in these richer areas. We see different ages of trees getting away. And all of these things come together to make a really complex woodland ecosystem. And that's what we're after here. We're after niches and we're after complexity. Because when it comes to fighting both the climate crisis and the environmental crisis, what we want is complex landscapes, which have lots of different niches for all the different species, which have refugia for species which are sort of climate refugees moving northwards. If there's one thing you take from this talk, it should be that the complex ecosystems are the best way to mitigate the impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. So it might all sound completely positive, and rewooding everywhere is exactly what we want to do. And that's certainly a part of what we're doing here. So this paper came out in 2020, and it gives a good indication of what we're sort of trying to achieve here. Native reforestation of open ground offers net gains in bird species richness, but could disbenefit open ground birds, including those of conservation concern. So one thing I hear a lot is that soon all we'll have in Scotland is trees, rows of Sitka spruce and all the rest of it. That's certainly not what we're trying to do here at Mar Lodge. What we're trying to do is create resilient and dynamic ecosystems which mix woodland areas with more open areas, we want a place which can have both meadow pipits and tree pipits, which can have both curlews and crossbills. But to create that sort of landscape, in the short term, we certainly needed to reduce the deer density in quite a substantial way. I think people sometimes underestimate just quite how knackered a lot of Scotland's woodlands are, and that was certainly the case at Mar Lodge. What we've done so far is really put the woodlands into intensive care. We're now beginning to come out of that process, and we can now begin to think about how the woodlands might look in the future, and how we can care for them in perhaps a less intensive way going forwards. Next slide, please. So our work isn't just in the woods, as I say. You know, we've got a huge area of high ground. This is a tea-leaf willow. This is sitting up at 800 meters altitude. It's one of the highest altitude tea-leaf willows in the country. I'm quite pleased with this little plant. Well, it's a very big plant, actually. So one of the habitats we've lost in Scotland is montane scrub or montane woodland. This is stuff at the natural limit of where trees grow. We have very little of this in Scotland, maybe as little as 600 meters of it over in Craigfiacloch and in Cairngorms. So one of the things we're trying to do is create, again, more resilient upland environments, places where we can expect to see red grouse and ring ouzel living into the future. Alongside that, we're also doing work on peatland restoration. This is quite new for us, but we're beginning to see good results from that in the last year or so. Just the other day, I was out surveying Dunlin on a restored site, which is all very exciting. We've talked a bit about hydrological processes. We do have a salmon run at Mar Lodge. We're part of the D, which is a very important salmon run. But salmon are really struggling for all sorts of reasons, and one of them is increased river temperatures. So one way we can try and ameliorate that is planting more trees or growing more trees, regenerating trees along river edges so that they can shade the banks, keep the river cool enough to keep it hospitable for salmon. And then we also do stuff, more traditional conservation, things like footpath maintenance, and looking after the cultural heritage of the estate. As I say, there's a very long and very interesting cultural history at Mar Lodge. Next slide, please. So we've started doing our peatland restoration stuff. The moors are still a very important part of the work we do here. The most exciting thing I'd say I've seen on the moors since I've been here is the recolonisation of the area by hen harriers. We had no records in living memory of breeding harriers on the estate before 2016. We've now got a very high proportion of all the breeding records in Scotland. We're doing lots of work in our bogs and peatland restoration. We're currently not burning. We last did muir burn in 2018. Muir burn's a very complicated and very difficult subject. Probably need a whole hour to talk about it properly. But these upland areas and these open upland areas are really important. And as we can see from the State of the UK's Bird Report 2019, upland birds are decreasing. They're having a really tough time for all sorts of reasons. So anything we can do to improve that, particularly re-wetting the bogs, making them climate proof for the future, is going to be good looking towards the future. But what we really want to think about again is, how do we define moorland? What do we think of when we go onto a moor, be it the moors of Hoy or the heather moors of the Angus Glens or the deer forests of Torridon? What is it we're looking at, and what values are we bringing to those landscapes? And also, are moors completely tree free? One thing we're trying to do is think of open ground and woodland areas not as discrete habitats, but actually as nodes on a spectrum of different types of habitat. Next slide, please. So that probably paints a fairly rosy picture of where we're going in the future. Unfortunately, that's not necessarily always going to be the case. So we're putting a lot of work into woodland creation, which has, and peatland restoration, which has important impacts on carbon sequestration. We're trying to mitigate the landscape, make it as complicated as possible to help offset the effects of climate change. We're returning lost species and habitats, increasing connectivity, increasing and also diversifying opportunities for people in Upper Deeside with regards to work. And we're also continuing the Highland sporting tradition here, which is a really important part of a lot of people's lives up here. I'd like to think that we're helping to we're adding to the conversation of what it means to be a Highland sporting estate in Scotland in the 21st century. But there are major challenges, most notably climate change and continued biodiversity loss. So, for example, here I've got just under where I stay, we've got house martins. The habitat's great for house martins here. They seem to be doing pretty well, but we can't do anything for house martins here in where they spend their winters. So Mar Lodge is still affected by, global issues. We're beginning to also see a loss of snow cover on the high tops. This is very concerning for species like ptarmigan, and to be completely honest with you, it's not that much we can do about that. We're also seeing longer periods of wildfire risk. That has impacts on how we think about managing vegetation going into the future, and also how we think about actually simply being in a landscape like this. Gone are the days where we can just have a fire and not think about it, that sort of thing. We are seeing more visitors, which is good. We want to see as many visitors as possible, but there are potential issues for that for species like black grouse, species which really struggle when they're disturbed. I've got a nice little wish list of species we might see here in the future. We can talk about that in the discussion if anyone would like. Next slide. So this is Berrydale. If we're thinking about landscapes, this is a really interesting one and a beautiful wood. I've only ever been there once, unfortunately. The most northerly woodland in Scotland, in a landscape that is really not completely dissimilar to Mar Lodge. A slightly different set of species. There's more willows and birches, and of course there's no pine here. But all I'd say to this really is what do we think when we look at this landscape, and how do we feel about it, and what is its place in Scotland, its cultural significance as the most northerly woodland we have. Next slide. So this is a greater butterfly orchid. I actually found this very plant back in 2020 during lockdown. While I was feeling very sorry for myself, I went out for a cycle and found this, and they're not particularly uncommon in Scotland, but this was the first one that we'd ever found at Mar Lodge. And it really gave me a boost finding it. It really helped me through a difficult time, thinking that there was this very nice species that was coming back to Mar Lodge. It looks like we've got a few more this year as well, hopefully. So we're not there yet. It's an ongoing process. We'll never be there. It's been very difficult. It's been fascinating, certainly for me. I mean, I came along in 2016 when most of the hard work had been done, to be honest. I've just had the privilege of talking to the people that did all the hard work as much as anything else. But success has come off the back of management input from the local community, Highland sporting interests, environmentalists. It really has been a collaborative effort. And this is the point I'd probably like to finish on. If we're thinking about landscape scale restoration, the most important element is the human factor. It's the people doing the work on the ground. It's the building of bridges, and specifically creating a culture where people are working together in common cause for the benefit of everyone. I think there's a narrowing window for addressing climate change. I think the only way we're going to do it is by building these bridges and going for it together, and all of that sort of stuff. So that's me, actually. That's my presentation. Thanks very much for listening, and any questions, I think.
Andrew, thank you so much for that. I originally come from the east of Scotland, so you referred to like the Angus Glens, the Heather Glens. But I also remember being a grouse beater there when I was a schoolboy in the summer. So land, there was a bit of conflict with land use in that area as well. I also know Deeside well. I did youth hostel there, hill walking, skiing in the Cairngorms, so I know all that well. And indeed, behind me just now, I live in Rossshire, and Ben Withers behind me has a massive plateau on its north side.
Yes, it does.
Absolutely massive. Oh, yeah, and it's that picture you showed with the Cairngorm plateaus. I went, oh, that's exactly that, So yeah, wonderful that I actually recognise and I have a feeling, a feel for the places as well, an emotion of the places. And I think you were describing in your talk people who have emotions for where they live and work. However, the dilemma, of course, is the conflict, is the mix of interests. And you mentioned very early on, it's a holistic approach which you're wanting to take. Not you, I mean everyone, that's involved in this. But it involves disparate interests, and you're trying to work as a cohesive whole. Quite a challenge, that, very big challenge. And there's a couple of questions have also come up which probably express that better. It's in this situation, where there are different interests. For example, in the role of deer, how has it been possible to reconcile quite vastly differing views and find solutions on which people can agree and find a way forward?
So I think one of the, I think this is the interesting thing about Mar Lodge and where it sits in this wider ecosystem of landscape scale restoration and actually land management as well, is this coming together between traditional Highland sporting interests and also environmentalists. It's not been an easy ride by any means. If you want to read more about it, I mean, read my book. But there's also there's a report online that there was a big management review in 2011, which is all documented online, and that came at a time when actually things were really quite heated between different sectors as to how to go ahead at Mar Lodge. In the long run, I think what has been really important is the commitment from the beginning of the trust to continue Highland sport. So I can very much see a future whereby Mar Lodge is continuing to practice Highland sport, specifically deer stalking in the woodlands again. And it's also worth saying that the income from Highland sports is actually helping to pay the wages of the stalkers who are working to regenerate the woodlands. One thing Mar Lodge does have, which is a real benefit, is a lot of space and a lot of open moor away from the woods, where you can tolerate higher levels of deer density, and where Highland sport is particularly deer stalking, but also grouse shooting, walk-type grouse shooting, is still very much possible. I think it's important to remember as well that we're working towards a 200-year plan. So things change a lot in 200 years. including cultural conventions. But at the end of the day, what we are committed to in that 200 years time is continuing to do deer sport here and deer stalking here. And I think that's been quite useful for assuaging the fears of some of the more traditional land management groups. Yes, does that answer?
Yeah. There's another one kind of tied in with this holistic approach. So, the Mar Estates, with this holistic, long-term approach, you appear to be working holistically. However, you showed a few slides of pretty hard press cuttings, and it must be very difficult. You're battling against groups or individuals with single interests, and the press, they can pick a single interest and make it headline whichever way they want, and it seems easy to pick you off in a way. That's what how do you feel about that?
Well, again, fortunately, I wasn't here for the difficult bits. That all fell to other people, and I've just been lucky enough to get to document the changes. I think it did take a big toll on people, including people from the sporting side of things here. There's no two ways about that. But I also think that things are beginning to change now. I think one of the real benefits, or hopefully one of the benefits for the nation, we talk about managing knowledge for the benefit of the nation. I think one of the long-term benefits will be as a demonstration project for showing what can happen in degraded woodland environments when you change management practices. And it's also been a testing ground. So it's been a place where we can work out what you can do and can't do within the specific remits of cultural conventions. And again, I think that will have, and it is already having an impact on how we perceive landscapes going forwards. So certainly there was a lot of pain here. I don't think there's any denying that. And those sorts of headlines are very difficult to deal with when you're trying to manage ground with the best of intentions. That is a really difficult thing to work with. All I can say to that is that I'm glad I wasn't doing it at the time, because I'm just not sure I'd be strong enough to do it. Fortunately, there were people here who were.
You had one of your early slides, Andrew, was you showed the landscape, and you go, what should we see? Now that got me thinking. There's another comment has come in as well. There are generations who actually now haven't seen the landscape as it was in the past. So what I was going to is, how would they know what it should look like? And there's another comment coming there. Looking at what's happened to the Highland landscape over several centuries, would it be true to say that it is a damaged landscape rather than, a natural one?
I think one of the things I've been grappling with at the minute is this whole concept of wildness versus non-wildness, and what place do humans have in a landscape? When we talk about damaged and degraded, those are naturally quite provocative terms. Sometimes I do look at ground in Scotland and I think, my goodness, that's knackered. That you see the hill is just seems to be crumbling apart. There's no vegetation anywhere. There's nothing to be seen. But actually, I think this is where an ecologist training comes in, and also a paleoecologist training comes in. We can look back in time through things like pollen cores, experimental ecology. Simply the stuff we're doing at Mar Lodge now is a way of looking back in time and seeing how natural processes develop. So those are all part of the picture. Unfortunately, the picture it keeps changing. Just because something was some way, say 2,000 years ago, doesn't necessarily mean it should be that way now. And that's going to be compounded going forwards with the environmental emergency and the climate emergency.
Yeah.
As if we're rewilding, we shouldn't be trying to create something that was in the past. We should be trying to create resilient landscape for the future. And that's a really important distinction. A resilient landscape for the future is one which has people in it, and one which supports human life and human culture, the best of us. But it's also one that's naturally and also by default, by definition, one that's biodiverse. Without biodiversity, we're basically nothing. So when I pose the question, what should a landscape look like? You can take that to mean lots of different things. And I think I'd like to leave it as an open-ended question. What values do we place on land, and what values do we place on biodiversity? Not just the biodiversity of woodlands, but also the biodiversity of open ground and all the mixtures in between.
Yeah, I actually like that. I like that as an open question, Andrew. It's there's a supplementary to one of the comments, which is the need now is not so much for preservation, but for healing damage and bringing it to the full life again. And that full life, which you've just said to me, might not necessarily be the life that was 2,000 years ago. It's something that has to fit for in the future, and the way climate is changing as well. It has to adapt to make sure that it's sustainable, isn't it? It's all about sustainability.
It's about sustainability, and it's quite a tricky thing to get your head around. And I think that's because we come from this cultural background of thinking of nature as being apart from humans. What we're trying to do at Mar Lodge is create as I said, a cohesive whole. So a biodiverse landscape, but one with a place for humans. I think that's a really important thing to say going forwards.
You're talking about encouraging massive amounts of tree planting, but lots of tree planting in the Highlands to offset climate change. I know there's a lot of people talking about that. That suggests to me, after listening to your talk, that needs to be part of a much bigger managed ecological picture.
So there's a really good place which has done some fabulous tree planting, Carifran down in the Borders. Volunteer led. They somehow managed to find the money to buy a 800 hectare glen, and then they planted it. But they didn't plant it in rows of Sitka or name your tree of choice. They looked at the underlying geology and the underlying sort of botanical communities, and they asked themselves what's going to grow well here, and what is going to work here from a biodiversity point of view. And that close attention to the ground, that close attention to the ecology of the landscape really has paid dividends, because the trees that are growing there now are growing well. They're growing in the places you would think they should be growing. And they've seen a sort of, at the same time, they've seen a parallel increase in botanical diversity and bird diversity and all the rest of it. So I'm not going to say there's no place for forestry by any means. We all live in timber houses and all of that sort of stuff. But there is also, I think it does come back to this idea of the right tree in the right place. And actually just the right plant in the right place, the right animal in the right place. And that is a really tricky thing to do, but it is possible. And I think an ecological education can certainly help you on the way to imagining these landscapes and what should and could be going where.
You mentioned earlier as well, Andrew, about how you're keeping your local stakeholders on side and actually working with you, contributing and things like that. Taking this further, right, this is a question that's coming from Cat Cowie. How is this received elsewhere, as a sort of a demonstration site, for want of a better word? Could this model help with community engagement elsewhere, do you think?
So the first thing I'd say is there's always more to be done for community engagement. You can never do enough, and you can never do it perfectly. There's probably stuff we're doing wrong here, and there's always more you can do for chatting with your neighbours, which is essentially what you're doing. I think the work we're doing is currently being received pretty well by quite a lot of different stakeholders from quite interesting places as well. I mean, I've been doing all sorts of guided tours and stuff for various stakeholders over the last few months. I think there is an important model. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote the book was I thought it was an interesting place which had interesting lessons that other places could learn from. But the flip side of that is that no single place is, well, every place is unique. There's always going to be unique factors in any landscape scale restoration project. So I think what's important for working with local communities and local stakeholders is actually working out what the local community needs. And that's not always going to be the same as what Braemar needs or what, Upper Deeside needs or wants. There's always got to be close attention to site-specific issues and questions.
Now, just focusing in on one particular stakeholder, and this is probably a very Scottish UK thing. What extent do you think current landowners in Scotland are actually willing to consider, let alone engage with the sort of changes you've seen at Mar Lodge or Mar Estates? And are there privately owned estates that are good examples of what can be done? You could reference them perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so the land, the sort of the Highlands are changing definitely at the minute. Some of that change is very positive. Some of it's perhaps a little worrying. I'm thinking of the rise of the Green Laird and perhaps some slightly ill thought out landscape scale conservation projects, which I won't name. But there are very much good examples of land ownership and land stewardship running across the gamut. So there are some fantastic community owned and led conservation groups and work, places like Carifran, but also out on Egg and up near Inverness. Gosh, the name escapes me. There are also, I think it's important to say that there's also private landowners who are doing interesting stuff, but those private landowners are doing it in different ways to each other as well. I mean, again, like I said, there's no perfect way of managing ground. But just over on the other side of the Cairngorms, for example, there's the Cairngorms Connect area, which is coming together of NGOs, public sector and the private sector to create one huge 600 square kilometre area, which is managed principally for nature. And then if we were to think from the more sporting side of things, there are absolutely some very good sporting estates out there doing very good stuff for nature. It might look a little bit different to what we're doing at Mar Lodge. A lot of the time, it'll actually look fairly similar. But it's important to recognise that. So places, Glentana, for example, further down Deeside, getting that mixture of different land management practices and generally in a positive way.
You seem to be well aware of the breadth of stuff that's going on. Is there a group of people or an organisation coordinating all these?
To be honest, I just go on holiday in Scotland, so travel around.
Just so that someone doesn't fall between the cracks, because
there's probably more that can be done for that. To be honest, I'm not going to lie. That's probably something that someone should do. Yeah. Not me though. I'm not doing it.
No, but there's a point of note, I think. Going on to there's some questions or comments coming in about sort of species. You mentioned the decline in numbers of upland birds. Is there any one single cause, or is it a combination of several, would you say?
A combination of several. Climate's the big one, but also both overgrazing and undergrazing can be bad for certain upland species, which makes life difficult. Historically, pollution was an issue. It gets really complicated with upland birds. Some species like Merlin and hen harrier, for example, need lots of areas of quite rank heather, and it seems to be that part of their decline is due to that, and also, of course, illegal bird of prey persecution. But then there's other issues like, waders are struggling with mesopredator overabundance. Things like crows and foxes in upland environments in numbers that simply weren't there a few decades ago. This is the other key take-home message I'd like from this talk, is that conservation is really hard. There's all sorts of conflicting and different factors, and they all get stuck together, and it creates a bit of a pain to disentangle it all, to be honest. So in the uplands, yes, it's a mixture of all sorts, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's related to that, there's an observation from an Arcadian going with the stoat trapping in Orkney.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
I've noticed more hen harriers and owls about.
Yeah, and of course, there's no better place than Orkney for hen harriers.
Yeah. Now, taking this, there's other aspects. I'm not sure if you mentioned them, but it's a kind of more the way things are going, like renewables, wind farms, and things like that. What impact are they having an impact in Mara Estates, or are they being? So
we don't have any, basically. So we have a biomass boiler that's been very good, actually. That's another story. We don't have wind farms near us. We're slap bang in the middle of a wildland area, in the middle of a national park, in the middle of an SPA for golden eagles. So there's not going to be any wind farms on our National Nature Reserve itself. Wind farms can have a detrimental impact on some species. There was a study from the Flow country, I think, that showed they could be quite detrimental for things like golden plover. But then they also they can have benefits for local communities. They also are obviously much greener than a coal-fired power plant. So, as with all of these things, there's no perfect solution. There's just a lot of imperfect solutions, and we need to somehow find the best way through to have the best benefit for as many things as possible. I certainly think wind farms are a part of the solution to the environmental and climate emergency, but there's no point in saying that they're perfect and there's some silver bullet, because they're obviously not. But we do have to make compromises and sacrifices somewhere along the way. And the question for us as land managers is where do we put those lines? Where do we make those compromises?
Also, the modern changes. Are you considering newer sports such as mountain biking, cross-country skiing? Do they impact on you at all?
So we do have cross-country ski. Well, funny enough, back in the 50s, the owners of the estate at the time tried to turn it into a ski centre, and it did not work. They put their ski centre in the wrong place, and the snow all melted, and bulldozed tracks to the top of Beneverd and created a bit of an eyesore. So the first thing the trust did was take that Land Rover track out and some of those impacts. So one thing we are seeing is an increase in mountain bikes, particularly e-bikes. We don't quite know what to make of them yet, to be honest. I certainly, and speaking in a personal capacity, I don't like seeing mountain bikes above the 900-meter contour, and probably lower than that as well. I'm a bird person. I like my ptarmigan and my dotterel, and there's you can disturb a lot of things on a bike, and you cause a lot of erosion to footpaths and all the rest of it. But we're in a bit of a knowledge black hole, actually, with these impacts. So I might not like the look of it, but right now we don't actually have much information to back up what we think, or what our gut is telling us. So I think the next thing we need to do, and this is a national debate, is work out what is the place for mountain bikes and e-bikes in the landscape. I mean, don't get me wrong, I take mountain bikes up vehicle tracks quite frequently, but only to the beginning of a valley glen, right? The glen rather than to the top of the hill. They can be a really good way of getting people into the countryside. They're pretty democratic, egalitarian. They're pretty carbon neutral generally. So there's a lot of positives, but again, nothing's perfect, unfortunately.
Yeah, I was actually wondering. You mentioned that European legislation. That was a big driver for getting things done. That was some of your your binding legal agreements. I'm confused with this one, I suppose, myself, but with Brexit or the change in relationship with Europe, are those legalities going to stay and keep driving things the way they have been?
I have no idea, to be completely honest with you. I mean, one week you're hearing stuff in the newspapers about how there's going to be lots of big pots of money for environmental restoration on farmland, and then 2 weeks later you hear the exact opposite. I genuinely don't think anyone knows in the long term. Scotland is probably a better place than England with these things, but that's by no means certain going into the future. To be completely honest with you, if anyone tells you otherwise, I think I think they're guessing as much as anything else. I think what we do need to do is think of this, whatever you think of Brexit, and I certainly know what I think of Brexit. Whatever you think of it, that now is the time for lobbying governments, whatever party you happen to follow, to enshrine very strong environmental protection laws in gold, and also to really push for increasing the landscape restoration, pushing it higher up the political agenda, because it really is. It's not the only way out of the climate crisis we're facing, but it's certainly a big part of it. And that now is the time for political action. I often get asked, what can I do to help the environment? And to be honest with you, sometimes I feel like it's a bit of a cop-out, but I feel like the answer is put political pressure on people in power to change things for the better.
Well, after successfully fielding all these tricky and difficult comments and questions, I've got one light-hearted one to finish with. How on earth do they dust all those skulls in the stag room?
Big ladder. It's massive. It's terrifying. I've seen them do it. It's genuinely terrifying.
A big ladder and plenty of PPE.
A big ladder and lots of PPE. Yeah. It's a sprung ballroom as well, so they make sure they're fastened pretty tightly as well, because you imagine the Kayleys that go on underneath it, bouncing the whole ballroom.
Oh, goodness, no. Andrew, can I just thank you very, very much for that enlightening, challenging and very thought-provoking talk. It's got me thinking, because this is my country and I'm very aware of it, and I want to preserve it for generations to come as well. I'd also like to thank the audience for actively taking part and submitting their perceptive questions. And if you've enjoyed tonight's talk, please put next week's in your diary. It begins at the same time, 7:30 p.m. And I'm hoping the link is being entered into YouTube as I speak. Next week's talk, South with Shackleton, is the last in this pre-festival Embers and Sparks series. And with the centenary of Sir Ernest Shackleton's death and the discovery of the wreck of his ship Endurance, this remarkable story of fear, hope, resilience, and good fortune is told by Orkney International Science Festival stalwart and polar historian, Dr. Maria Pia Casarini. Andrew, thank you once again. And can I also give thanks to Swain and John, who make the magic happen behind the scenes. And especially to you, the viewers and listeners, for joining us this evening. And with that, it's time to say Goodbye for now.
Thank you.